Christianity once built the very foundations of the West. It wasn't just a belief system, it shaped law, art, education, morality, even the rhythm of daily life. Cathedrals dominated skylines, Sunday services filled pews, and questioning the church could cost you everything. But today, something almost unthinkable has happened. Christianity's grip is slipping, and it's slipping fast. Churches stand empty, some converted into cafes, apartments, even nightclubs. Countries once called Christian nations now report record numbers of people identifying as non-religious. Baptisms, once routine, are quietly skipped. So what happened? Why is Christianity losing ground in the very lands it once ruled? Some will say it's because of scandals. Others blame science. But the truth runs much deeper and much stranger. It's not just one cause, but dozens, weaving together into a story of collapse. And here's the twist. The real reasons are not the ones you're told in church. They're cultural, psychological, economic, and in many ways, unstoppable. So in this video, we're going to break it all down. The hidden forces behind Christianity's decline, the shifts nobody can ignore, and the reason this centuries-old faith may never recover. But let's start with the first and most obvious domino to fall: information itself. The information explosion. For most of history, the church had a monopoly on knowledge. Ordinary people couldn't read the Bible for themselves, and in many places, they weren't even allowed to. Scripture was locked away in Latin, a language only clergy and elites could access. Sermons weren't just spiritual lessons, they were gatekeeping. If you wanted answers about life, death, morality, or the universe, you had to go through the church. That monopoly gave religion enormous power. When you control the story, you control the people. And for centuries, Christianity thrived on that advantage. But fast forward to today, and everything has changed. With a smartphone in your pocket, you can pull up biblical contradictions in seconds. You can read ancient myths that predate Christianity and sound eerily familiar. You can stream debates between theologians, scientists, and historians from your living room. Knowledge no longer belongs to the pulpit. It belongs to everyone. And here's the critical part. Once people see that Christian stories aren't unique, that resurrection myths, flood myths, virgin births, all existed long before the Bible, the exclusive authority of Christianity starts to crumble. If other cultures had similar myths, why should one version be treated as ultimate truth? But it's not just the internet. Even before Google, printing presses, mass literacy, and universities chipped away at the church's control. Each wave of access weakened the idea that one institution could dictate reality. Still, information alone doesn't explain everything. If it did, Christianity would have collapsed centuries ago. So why now? Why is the decline accelerating in our lifetime? That's where the next piece of the puzzle comes in: trust. Because information only matters if you believe the messenger. And for millions of people, trust in the church has shattered beyond repair. Broken trust. Information may have opened the cracks, but scandal blew them wide open. For centuries, clergy were viewed as the moral backbone of society, untouchable, unquestionable, the voice of God on earth. Priests, pastors, bishops weren't just religious figures. They were community leaders, political influencers, and guardians of public trust. But what happens when the guardians are caught betraying the very values they preach? Decade after decade, stories of abuse, corruption, and cover-ups have surfaced. Priests exploiting children, megachurch leaders hoarding millions, televangelists begging for donations while flying in private jets. Each revelation chips away at credibility, not just of individuals, but of the institution itself. Because when leaders fail, ordinary believers start asking uncomfortable questions. If the shepherds are this corrupt, what does that say about the flock? If the people closest to God can act this way, is the problem deeper than human weakness? Could it be baked into the system itself? Trust, once broken, doesn't return easily, and in religion, it's everything. People may forgive mistakes in politics or business, but when betrayal happens under the banner of holiness, it cuts differently. It doesn't just expose hypocrisy, it shakes the foundation of faith. The church can try damage control, apologies, reforms, promises of accountability, but the scars remain, and every time a new scandal emerges, old wounds reopen. For many, this isn't just about leaders. It's about realizing the structure that allowed abuse and corruption to thrive might be inseparable from the religion itself. And yet, even scandals alone can't explain Christianity's freefall. Because while trust erodes among adults, the real tipping point is happening elsewhere. In the next generation, young people aren't just drifting away from Christianity. They're growing up without it at all. And that's a problem no scandal apology can fix. Generational shift. If scandals fracture trust among older believers, the younger generation is accelerating Christianity's decline at a pace that feels irreversible. For centuries, religion relied on one powerful strategy: start them young. Children were baptized, sent to Sunday school, and taught stories long before they had the tools to question them. Belief wasn't a choice, it was inheritance. And once belief is woven into identity from childhood, it usually sticks. But that chain is breaking. Studies from Pew Research and other major surveys show a dramatic shift. Millennials and Gen Z are far less religious than their parents and grandparents. Many never formed strong ties to Christianity in the first place. And once that link is lost, it doesn't easily regenerate. A family that skips baptisms, church services, and Bible studies doesn't suddenly return to them in the next generation. The decline compounds, and churches know this. That's why they invest so heavily in youth programs, flashy services, Christian rock concerts, desperate attempts to stay relevant. But here's the problem. Young people are raised in a world where belief is optional, not mandatory. When given the freedom to choose, many choose independence. Ask a teenager today why they don't go to church, and the answers are blunt. It's boring. It's outdated. It doesn't reflect my values. The fear of hell that once kept people in line, it barely registers. Eternal reward doesn't appeal when life itself offers endless opportunities for meaning and connection without religion. And here's the cliffhanger. Even if youth programs could win a few hearts back, they're fighting against a much stronger force: education. Because in classrooms, students are trained to ask questions that churches have spent centuries discouraging. And once those questions start, the answers rarely point back to the pews. Education and critical thinking. If generational change is the fuse, education is the spark that lights it. Christianity thrived in eras where questioning the church was not just discouraged, but dangerous. Doubt could mean exile. Criticism could mean death. Knowledge wasn't a tool for exploration. It was a weapon controlled by the clergy. But modern classrooms flipped that script. Universities, libraries, and now the internet encourage something the church has always feared: asking why. Why does Genesis contain two different creation stories? Why do moral codes exist in societies untouched by Christianity? Why do miracles vanish the moment they're studied under controlled conditions? These aren't hostile questions, they're honest ones. But honesty and blind faith rarely coexist for long. Education teaches evidence over authority, debate over obedience, proof over proclamation. And once students learn to evaluate claims critically, doctrines built on faith alone struggle to compete. The data backs this up. The higher the level of education, the lower the level of religious belief. This isn't a coincidence. Exposure to diverse cultures, philosophies, and scientific explanations makes it harder to cling to the idea that one book contains the only truth. Think about it. A student can sit in a philosophy class and compare Christianity's claims side by side with Buddhism, Islam, or secular humanism. Suddenly, Christianity looks less like the one truth and more like one of many. And once that realization takes root, the church can't unteach it. But here's the kicker. Education doesn't just dismantle old answers. It also exposes people to new ones: science, psychology, and philosophy that explain the world without appealing to the supernatural. Which leads us straight into the next domino to fall: science itself. Because the more we learn about the natural world, the less room there is for a God of the gaps. Science shrinks the supernatural. For most of human history, the unknown was God's playground. Lightning, divine anger, disease, punishment for sin, a drought. a test of faith. Religion thrived in those gaps, the mysteries no one could explain. And for centuries, Christianity pointed to those mysteries as proof of its truth. But here's the problem. Every time science answers a question, the space for God gets smaller. Take astronomy. Once, Earth was the center of creation. Then telescopes revealed billions of galaxies, stretching farther than the Bible ever imagined, or biology. The church taught humans were uniquely crafted, separate from all other creatures. Then Darwin showed we share common ancestry with every living thing, medicine too. Where once people prayed for healing, now antibiotics, surgeries, and vaccines succeed where prayer fails. Each step forward makes divine intervention feel less necessary. The so-called God of the gaps keeps retreating, replaced by natural explanations. And here's the irony. The more Christians resist science, the more outdated they look. Denying evolution, climate change, or even basic medical progress doesn't strengthen faith, it exposes its fragility. Ask yourself, if a religion insists that truth must bend to fit ancient texts, how long can it survive in a culture built on evidence? And science doesn't just explain the physical world, it challenges core doctrines. Neuroscience suggests consciousness is a product of the brain, not an immaterial soul. Cosmology shows the universe could emerge without a divine hand. Even morality looks more like a social adaptation than a gift from God. The old answers, miracles, divine punishment, cosmic design, simply don't hold up under scrutiny. But science isn't the only factor. There's another equally powerful force reshaping belief in the West: diversity. Because once you see other religions up close, the claim that only one faith is true becomes harder and harder to defend. Culture and diversity. Religion thrives in isolation. When everyone around you believes the same thing, it feels less like belief and more like fact. For centuries, entire towns, nations, even continents were shaped under the assumption that Christianity was the only path to truth. But step into any modern Western city, and that illusion collapses. Walk down the street and you'll meet Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, and spiritual seekers all living side by side. Children grow up with classmates who celebrate different holidays, eat different foods, and worship different gods, or none at all. The result? Christianity no longer looks universal. It looks like one tradition among many. And that realization is devastating for a religion built on exclusivity. If billions of people across the world believe with equal passion in their gods, why assume one version is correct while all others are wrong? To a generation raised in multicultural environments, the claim that Christianity alone has access to truth doesn't feel comforting. It feels arrogant. This shift turns faith into something recognizable, a human invention. Beliefs start to look less like revelations from heaven and more like cultural stories, created, shaped, and revised by people trying to make sense of their world. And once people see belief as cultural, not divine, Christianity loses its power to claim universality. But here's the twist. Culture alone doesn't explain why entire societies walk away from religion, because even in diverse environments, people often cling to belief for comfort. What really accelerates Christianity's decline is something subtler, something that eats away at its foundations, not through scandal or education, but through success. And that force is prosperity, wealth, and security. Here's a paradox the church doesn't like to talk about. Christianity often thrives in struggle, but withers in stability. Look at global patterns. The more prosperous and secure a society becomes, the less religious it island. Poorer nations, where access to healthcare, education, and stable governments is fragile, often cling tightly to faith. Religion offers hope, comfort, and a promise that suffering has meaning. But in wealthier nations, the need fades. When a child is sick, parents trust doctors, not priests. When someone loses a job, they rely on unemployment benefits, not prayer. When disasters strike, insurance companies and government aid step in. Slowly but surely, the promises of religion, healing, provision, protection are replaced by social safety nets and human-made systems that actually work. Faith once filled the void of insecurity. Now, hospitals, schools, and modern infrastructure fill that role. And once people realize their quality of life doesn't depend on prayer, Christianity loses one of its strongest selling points. Wealth doesn't erase all suffering, but it does remove the constant desperation that kept people looking to heaven. A comfortable life makes the fear of hell or the lure of paradise less persuasive. Why trade joy today for promises tomorrow when you already have stability? And that stability does something deeper. It frees people to think about morality in new ways. Once survival isn't on the line, people start asking bigger questions. Not, how do I avoid punishment? But, what's actually fair? What's truly good? And here's the cliffhanger. Those moral questions don't always point back to the Bible. In fact, many times, morality itself starts turning against the church. Morality leaves the church behind. For centuries, Christianity claimed to be the guardian of morality. The church insisted it set the standard for right and wrong, and society followed. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of the greatest moral advances in history happened not because of Christianity, but in spite of it. Think about it. Civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ acceptance, each of these movements faced fierce resistance from church leaders and institutions. Instead of leading moral progress, Christianity often dug in its heels, quoting scripture to defend slavery, to keep women silent, or to condemn love between consenting adults. And when the world changed anyway, the church eventually adjusted, but always late, always reluctantly. That's a problem. If morality is supposed to come from eternal divine truth, why does it keep bending under cultural pressure? Why does the church fight progress until it has no choice but to surrender? To younger generations especially, this isn't just hypocrisy. It's proof that religion isn't the source of morality at all. If anything, it's an obstacle. And when moral leadership comes from activists, philosophers, and ordinary people rather than preachers, Christianity starts to look like it's blocking the path forward rather than guiding it. This reversal is devastating. Once a religion is seen as holding society back, respect collapses quickly. People don't want to follow an institution that seems more interested in control than compassion. And the problem cuts deeper when people start looking not just at the church's behavior, but at the Bible itself. Because if the perfect Word of God contains contradictions, outdated laws, and moral failings, then the foundation of Christian authority begins to crumble. And when the Bible itself comes under the microscope, the Bible problem. For centuries, the Bible was untouchable. Few people read it for themselves, and when they did, it was through the lens of priests who told them what it really meant. Reverence thrived on distance. But once literacy spread and critical scholarship took hold, the cracks became impossible to hide. Suddenly, people could see with their own eyes that the Bible wasn't a seamless revelation, it was a patchwork. Contradictions leap off the page. 2 different genealogies for Jesus, 2 conflicting creation stories, accounts of events that can't both be true. And then there are the prophecies, predictions that never materialized, timelines that don't add up, promises that went unfulfilled. Even more damaging are the myths that clearly predate Christianity. Flood stories, virgin births, dying and rising gods, all borrowed from older traditions and rebranded as original. Once people recognize the recycling, the claim of divine uniqueness evaporates. The Bible stops being a flawless holy book and starts looking like what it is, a human document, written, edited, and reinterpreted across centuries. And once people read it critically, reverence fades fast. Think about it. If the foundation of a faith rests on a text, and that text loses its aura of perfection, what happens to the structure built on top of it? That's where Christianity faces its biggest weakness. The moment the Bible is seen not as divine revelation but as human storytelling, the entire claim of eternal truth collapses. And when sacred texts lose power, rituals start to collapse too. Rituals and symbols hollowed out. For most of history, rituals and symbols carried Christianity's weight. Sunday services, baptisms, weddings, funerals, these weren't just ceremonies, they were the glue of community life. The cross, once a symbol of sacrifice and salvation, commanded awe wherever it appeared. But today, those same rituals feel hollow. Across Europe and North America, churches stand empty or repurposed, turned into apartments, restaurants, even nightclubs. What was once sacred space is now real estate. and the rituals that once defined identity are increasingly optional. A wedding doesn't need a priest. A funeral doesn't need a sermon. People celebrate milestones with secular ceremonies, music, or even online gatherings. The sense of belonging religion once monopolized is now freely available elsewhere. Even Christianity's most sacred symbols are fading into decoration. The cross is no longer just an emblem of faith. It's jewelry, fashion, even tattoos worn without a trace of belief. When symbols lose their sacred edge, they lose their power. And this erosion goes deeper than attendance. It speaks to a cultural shift. People don't need religion to provide community, art, or meaning anymore. Netflix, social media, activism, and secular traditions fill those roles more effectively without demanding belief in the supernatural. For a religion built on collective ritual and reverence for symbols, this is devastating. Once the ceremonies lose significance, the faith behind them doesn't just weaken, it collapses. But here's the real twist. While rituals fading is visible and measurable, there's an even stronger force working quietly in the background. A force so subtle most people don't notice it, yet it may be the most powerful driver of Christianity's decline. And it's hidden in plain sight, the death of fear. For much of Christian history, fear was the church's greatest weapon. Fear of hell, fear of eternal punishment, fear that one wrong choice, one doubt, one slip could doom you forever. It was a terrifying thought, and it worked. Entire generations stayed loyal, not out of love, but out of dread. But today, that fear is crumbling. Surveys show fewer and fewer people in the West believe in hell at all, and without hell, the threat collapses. If eternal fire isn't real, then why obey the institution that uses it as leverage? If punishment after death is just a story, then the chains it forged lose their grip. This shift is monumental, because when fear loses power, freedom takes its place. Suddenly, people can question without guilt. They can live without constantly looking over their shoulder. They can choose morality, compassion, and meaning for themselves, not because they're terrified of damnation, but because they actually want to live well. And once someone tastes that freedom, it's almost impossible to drag them back into submission. A person who no longer fears hell doesn't need the church to tell them how to live. They don't need priests, rituals, or dogmas to keep them safe. That's why this trend cuts deeper than any scandal, any contradiction, or any cultural shift. The fear of eternal punishment was Christianity's invisible anchor, and once it's gone, the religion starts drifting with no way to pull it back. And that shift is almost impossible to reverse. So why is Christianity losing ground in the West? It isn't one single reason. It's a perfect storm. Knowledge spread beyond the pulpit. Scandals shattered trust. Generations grew up without obligation to believe. Science explained mysteries once reserved for God. Culture became diverse. Wealth replaced insecurity, and morality left the church behind. The Bible itself no longer commands reverence. Rituals and symbols feel hollow, and perhaps most importantly, the fear of hell, the church's oldest weapon, has lost its sting. Once people stop trembling, they start thinking. Once they stop fearing, they start living. And that shift, as we've seen, is almost impossible to undo. Here's the bigger point. The decline of Christianity doesn't mean the decline of meaning, morality, or community. Those things haven't disappeared, they've just moved. Into education, activism, art, humanism, science, and countless secular spaces where they no longer require divine permission. People aren't abandoning purpose. They're choosing purpose on their own terms. And that's what terrifies the institutions that once demanded obedience. Because once you see that you don't need them, their power vanishes. So the next time someone says the West is losing its faith, remember, it's not a loss at all, it's a transformation. A culture built on fear and submission is giving way to one built on freedom, curiosity, and choice. And this is only the beginning. In fact, in my next video, we'll dive even deeper into this transformation, exploring how religions didn't just decline, but borrowed, copied, and recycled ideas from each other to survive. You'll see that Christianity's decline is just one part of a much bigger story. So if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on religion, make sure you subscribe right now. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.